11. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our virtual lecture. As you know, these are part of our Arts Reach lectures. So normally before the pandemic, we would bring these in person to senior centers across San Diego County. But now we're doing it all together online. And that means that we can invite all members of our community to these lectures. So we're very excited to present today 19th century American art. Before we do so, I just want to go over a couple of kind of housekeeping guidelines. So if you're in our Zoom room, we just ask that you stay muted for the duration of the lecture. So you're already muted, your microphone's off, you can just go ahead and keep it that way. If you have any questions or comments during the lecture, we're going to do a big Q&A at the end. So you can put all your questions and comments in the chat. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a speech bubble and it says chat underneath. That's on Zoom. You can click that and then put any questions and comments in that chat box, and we'll do, as I said, a Q&A at the end. If you're joining us on Facebook, welcome to you as well, and you can put all of your questions and comments in the comment section on Facebook, and I have it open in front of me on another screen, so I'm monitoring that, and we can get your questions and comments in at the end as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our docent, Karen Hjalmarson, who has been giving these lectures since, as I said, before the pandemic, and we're so glad that she was able to adapt to our virtual format. So Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you for, once again, 19th century American art.
Thank you so much, Allison. I just want to put a little plug in for our wonderful Allison Grenda, who will be leaving her internship at the Timken. She'll be starting an amazing PhD program at the University of Michigan. We have been so blessed to have Allison. She really makes these lectures possible with all her technological skills, her knowledge of art, since she already has a master's in art history. And we're going to wish her very well. She will be leaving at the end of the month, but we will have someone who will be continuing in her capacity. So Allison, thank you so much for all the work you've done. So we'll start with this wonderful painting by Thomas Birch. This is in our Timken collection. What we're going to focus on is the Hudson River painters of the American 19th century. We will, however, start with a few colonial paintings, because I always feel that it's good to see sort of the predecessors of the artists we are talking about. So Thomas Birch was one of the early members of the Hudson River painters. Now, you might say, Hudson River, wow, that doesn't look like the Hudson River Valley. It looks like a seascape. You know, there were different branches of the Hudson River School. And as we get closer to the artists who were doing like the Hudson River Valley, like Thomas Cole, who originated the movement, we'll talk more specifically about that. But I just want to tell you that we are going to look at all the changes that occur in the 19th century in America. Remember, we have the early industrialization of our country, and that begins at the beginning of the 1800s. It goes through till after the Civil War. We also have surveying expeditions. We have discovery, exploration, settlement going on in America. We have a change in the agrarian way of life. We have the American Civil War in the 1860s. So a lot is happening in America. America is really changing. So before we talk too much about just the origins of the American Hudson River School, which was really the truly first American school of art. Remember, art was really prominent in France and Italy, if you talk about Western civilization. But in the 19th century, we begin to see America creating their own school of art. So this magnificent painting I will be talking about in just a few slides. So let's begin with our colonial paintings. And this is John Singleton Copley, Mrs. Thomas Gage. And this is one of our most magnificent paintings in the Timken. This is one of our collection. And it's an exquisite portrait of a society woman who was married to Thomas Gage. Her name was Margaret Kemble. She came out of New York from a very prominent family, and she married Thomas Gage, who was in charge of all the British troops in America during the American Revolution. And she was a beautiful woman, and this was painted by Copley, who was considered the preeminent portrait painter of the early colonial period. This painting predates about 2 or 3 years before the American Revolution. Now, a couple things you should know about Copley. Copley studied with Benjamin West. They were age contemporaries, but Copley really drew inspiration from West. Both West and Copley had ties to England In fact, they actually resided in England, particularly in the later part of their lives. So they were connected to England and the high levels of British society and American society, or colonial society, I should say. Now, Copley, as I mentioned, was the preeminent portrait painter. And it's obvious in this exquisite rendering of this beautiful woman. She's dressed in a very interesting outfit. So let's talk about that for a second. She wears a loose fitting gown, and Copley is so talented in creating all the details, the folds of the dress and the lines of fabric, of the twisting of the bodice. And it is actually a dressing gown, not a ball gown. So perhaps it indicates that this was more for a private painting for the husband, maybe for their private quarters. Why isn't it a ball gown? Well, because the Revolutionary War begins about 2 years before this painting was done, and lots of things are happening in the colonies, and there aren't balls going on. It's just too difficult of a time. So that's hence, the dressing gown. Also, a ball gown would be much have more structure. This is a very loose fitting gown. She wears a turban. We'll talk a little bit about that. Why? Well, first of all, even as early as the Baroque, maybe even later Renaissance, through the Rococo, artists depicted women in these very elaborate costumes. These society women loved to dress up in costumes that were inspired by travels to exotic places, places like North Africa, places like Turkey and Greece. And so many of the society women like to incorporate these costume elements into their own everyday wear or formal wear, to be exact. Now, here we have a turban, pardon me, and the turban represents Margaret Kimball's connection to her father, who was of Turkish descent, and also her mother was of Greek descent. So it kind of shows a familial link as well as a society link. She's wearing pearls. She has beautiful pearls around her neck. The pearls decorate her hair. She has pearls at her sleeve. And I've mentioned so many times in my lectures that the pearls were the bling of that time period and earlier in the Renaissance, in the Baroque. So pearls were like the diamonds. So it shows her upper class status. Now, look at how exquisitely the light falls on her beautiful skin, kind of that rosy glow, a little bit of chiaroscuro right on the face. She looks at like an independent and intelligent woman. She doesn't look vapid or vacuous. She stares without a lot of presumption, let's say. She looks introspective and very beautiful. The chair is exquisitely done, a velvet chair with the nail heads and that very dark background that is most likely inspired from the Baroque. So this is one of our most important paintings in the Timken, and it is what Copley felt his very most important painting. After this painting was done, like the Gage family, Copley also went to England and he did aristocratic portraits and such for the British aristocracy. I'm going to go on to one more colonial painting, excuse me. And this is by the student of Copley, Benjamin West. He was considered the Raphael of American painting. So Copley and West are in the latter part of the 18th century considered our most preeminent artists. Now, Fidelity and Speranza, faith, fidelity, faith and hope. And when you look at this, you might think it has Greco-Roman overtones, and it does to some extent, but really this painting is based on the work of Edmund Spenser, who was an Elizabethan writer. And he wrote a book called The Fairy Queen, and it talks about Christian virtue. So this is actually inspired by the Fairy Queen. Remember, this is the time of William Shakespeare, the Fairy Queen, that is, not the painting, of course. So what do we have? Faith and hope. And Faith is dressed in white garb. She holds the New Testament and a gold chalice with a snake emerging. And what could that mean? Well, you think about it, faith, of course, there's a religious connection there, but also that she has so much belief in her own connection to God and faith that she's not bothered by a snake that could possibly hurt her. So her attributes, the chalice and the New Testament, excuse me. Now hope holds an anchor in the crook of her right arm, and that was the attribute or item that would identify hope. So this is a very inspired painting in terms of Christian iconography. So what do I mean by that? What we have in this story is Uta and the Red Knight. And the Red Knight has actually committed some acts that he's not terribly proud of. And Uta, truth, wants to bring him into the light in this alcove that represents spirituality and Christianity and faith. So he is being led into this beautiful space. And you can see with Wes, he has so much skill, not only as a painter of the figure, but you see this exquisite background, the cloud formation and the kind of spiritual light that falls in that archway. And that shows this combination of not only neoclassicism that is emerging here and in France, but also romanticism. We're beginning to see the elements of romanticism in this painting. So it's romantic and it's neoclassical. As I mentioned, their posture is in what was used in ancient Greece and Rome, contrapposto, that is the shifting weight. They wear beautiful gowns that seem to come from antiquity. They look at each other with just sort of a profound connection. You see almost like a halo on faith. So that's rather remarkable. And then you see as a white, the Red Knight and Uta try to move into this spiritual space. Which is very interesting about Benjamin West is he gained a lot of notoriety for painting General Wolfe. That was probably one of his most famous paintings, but he was a great figurative artist. But as you can see, as I mentioned, landscape and interiors. So West was one of the most important artists living in America at this time. Now, we're going to go on to really the genesis of the Hudson River painters. And this is Kindred Spirits by Asher B. Duran. So let's talk a little bit about the movement. Thomas Cole, who was born in England and died young, he died in his 40s, but he really was the originated this concept of the Hudson River painters. Now, here we are in the Catskill Mountains in the Hudson River Valley, and we have two very important people, William Cullen Bryant and Thomas Cole. So Thomas Cole was really inspired by the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. They were connected to the Transcendentalist movement. They were connected to this idea of romanticism, to really look at landscape as something that is so profoundly beautiful and moving, this ineffable quality of the landscape. And what the Transcendentalist movement, which is based on some Christian principles and even Hinduism, that we should find beauty and God in nature. So many of these artists who became Hudson River painters wanted to show nature at its most profound. William Cullen Bryant was also connected to the works of Thoreau and Emerson. He was a writer, a journalist, and what Cole wants to show in this painting of the two of them on this ledge is that art and literature are very closely aligned. And so, as I say, Bryant was a writer, Cole was a painter, and so they are connected in this spiritual quest to find beauty in nature, to preserve nature. Because you have to remember, the Industrial Revolution in America is occurring, and so things are changing. America is no longer just an agrarian society. So just quickly, let's go back to just this specific painting. The person holding the portfolio in a brush is Thomas Cole. And he first came to the Catskill Mountain Ranges about 1825, and he was just enamored with its incredible beauty. But he started to connect with Bryant, and they became created kind of a pact to promote this, the Transcendentalist movement and the importance of the American landscape. Now, something I want to point out to you as these Hudson River painters, and they were named after the Hudson River Valley where coal first started, and people like some of the other Hudson River painters who I'm going to show you in just a second, they first concentrated here, but eventually they moved to other places. And as I show you more paintings, I'm going to show you the other places. But specifically, this painting is very romanticized. It's natural and realistic in some aspects if you look at the trees and the geography. However, he embellished. He sort of did a composite of 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲𝗰𝗵 and rocky promontory. There's just this beautiful romantic light that pervades the canvas. And the other thing is, if you can see, their initials are actually carved on a tree in the foreground, kind of showing that they were very connected. Now, where is this painting? I want to tell you a little bit of a story. This painting was given to Bryant by Asher B. Durand. Durand was the painter, of course, and he gave it to Bryant because at a year after this painting, around the time this painting was done, Cole died. So the painting was done after Cole died and then given to Bryant just to honor their friendship. Now, it was in the Bryant family and then given to the New York Public Library, where it was beautifully displayed and one of the most, the jewels in their collection. However, one of the Walmart heiresses decided to start her own museum called Crystal Bridges in Arkansas, Bentonville, as it were. And so she was able to purchase the painting for $35 million. Now, it caused a lot of uproar because they said, why are you deaccessioning this magnificent painting? This is the most iconic Hudson River painting and so important to American art history. However, she was able to outbid everybody else, and the library really needed the money. So you can see it today in the Crystal Bridges Museum. And I recommend that when things open up completely, that if you have a chance to go there, because it's quite remarkable. So here we have the most iconic, most important Hudson River painting. Now, let's go back to our beautiful American ship in distress. Thomas Birch, unlike Cole, did concentrate a lot on seascapes. He was most preeminent American seascape painter at that time in the early to mid 19th century. He was very influenced by Joseph Vernet, who we actually have one of his paintings, who was painted around 1780s, the early part of the 19th century. So Birch was very aware of his paintings. He did a lot of ships. Thomas Birch liked to paint ships in distress. And he actually started off as a miniaturist, but he soon began to paint seascapes. So where did he become famous? He became famous for painting the sea battles during the War of 1812. And then he did the shipping industry. And he was influenced very importantly by two artists, John Constable and J.M.W. Turner, two British painters. And this is more reminiscent of J.M.W. Turner, who showed man being overcome by nature, as opposed to John Constable, who was showing man coexisting peacefully in nature. We don't see a peaceful coexistence here because we see a ship about to capsize. And what we have is the waves are crashing against the side of the boat. It's very dramatic. We have this exquisite light that is filtered through the left and goes in a diagonal to the right. We see the white caps and small boats trying to help out the people on distress. You can see those tiny little figures, and they're trying to lower the lifeboat. And also you can see the rescue boats coming to the right, and also one in the distance. Also in the background, we see a promontory, a rocky promontory, and a lighthouse, which is pretty ubiquitous in seascapes. Now, as I mentioned, this boat is about to capsize. The sails are ripped, the mast is snapped, and the boat may capsize. What's interesting about this painting is it actually had a companion piece, a little bit smaller, that showed sort of a benign seascape. So what was often done in England and in America, that artists would do sort of the crazy, tumultuous events in the sea, man being overcome by nature, but also the peaceful coexistence of people sailing in a bay or something like that. So this is a very dramatic Timken painting, and it represents how the Hudson River painters, as I mentioned, they were named after the Hudson River Valley, began to branch out. They began to paint the ocean. They began to paint all through America. California, for example, which we'll see with Bierstadt. So we'll go on and we'll look at another painting by Thomas Cole. And this is called Course of the Empire, the Savage State. Cole did 5 paintings in this series. And what he wanted to document is how life was so idyllic and beautiful and connected to nature when the Native Americans were existing peacefully in this wilderness area. And what Cole was worried about is he saw industrialization taking place in America. He saw the agrarian way of life eroding some of the fabric of our country. He wanted to connect spiritually, intellectually with our beautiful landscape. He wanted us to find God in the landscape. And he wanted to show how life could be peaceful and not so driven by greed, which was happening when these factories are beginning to be built and people were being settling in this region. So this is one of 5. This is actually his first one, The Course of the Empire, meaning, you know, sort of the evolution of the development of our country. And what we see is Native American life. We see on the left in the middle to foreground, we see a hunter with his bow, and he's going after a deer that's kind of leaping to the right. In the middle, back onto the right, we also see teepees and smoke. So, and then of course, in the middle ground of the painting, again on a little rocky promontory, we also see more Native Americans in activity. So what he shows is a couple of things. He shows that life used to be simpler and maybe more connected to nature on earlier times. He shows the grandeur of the American landscape, and look at that cloud-filled sky. These artists were so influenced by light. Light was crucial to their artwork. Also crucial was the observation of nature, even though they embellished, and even though sometimes they did some composite creations of the landscape, meaning they might make something bigger or smaller or put in different aspects of the landscape. But they were influenced by the Dutch and the British artists. And you can see that light-filled sky, very reminiscent of artists like Van Rysdale from the Dutch Baroque. You can see how important light is and the study of nature, the studies of clouds and the wilderness. So this is one of Cole's most important works. Now, this one is quite remarkable because you look at this autumn foliage and you're just overcome with its beauty and grandeur. So Niagara Falls, and I hope many of you have visited Niagara Falls. I know I did as a young woman, and just really amazing. But what I noticed, and I'm going to mention this because if you look at this, this is not exactly how Niagara Falls looked like even in 1830. You might say, oh, it was so long ago. Of course, it was beautiful and natural. No, not really. Even at this time, there were factories nearby. Smoke was billowing into the environment. We had small little businesses, shops, and whatnot. So it wasn't pristine and beautiful like that. When I visited Niagara Falls, I meant to say that I was sort of taken by all the, let's say, business and commerce surrounding this exquisitely beautiful region. And so even Cole wanted to eliminate the merging industrialization that was occurring even in this remote place. What you can see, however, in this particular painting is how enraptured he is with the natural beauty of this scene. And the autumn leaves are just on fire, just exquisite palette, and the wonderful green of the trees, and the water cascading down, and the lush landscape, in the clouds, the light falling through that spiritual light. Again, remember, he was connecting God and spirituality to nature. And then we see 2 figures that create scale for the painting. And that's quite important in these landscape paintings. So this is one of Cole's most exquisite depictions of the American landscape. Now, in contrast to Cole, we have what we call the second generation of Hudson River painters. So as I mentioned earlier, we have some early Hudson River painters like Asher B. Durand, Thomas Cole, who were the first to really begin this movement and concentrate on the Hudson River Valley. But as you can see, even Cole branched out Niagara Falls and other parts of the United States. And Fitzhenry Lane was a second generation Hudson River painter. And the second generation was basically mid 19th century till about 1871, 1875. So the third quarter of the 19th century. And Lane painted New England. He was from New England, and his father was a sailmaker, and he grew up around boats and harbors and the ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, and he wanted to be a naval officer or a sailor. But unfortunately, Lane developed what we think was polio and was rendered partially paralyzed. So he couldn't go to be an officer. So he decided to use his incredible skills as an artist to depict the New England seacoast. And he was very inspired by Castine Harbor, Maine. Now, Castine Harbor is a very important place in American history because it was the site of the worst revolutionary battle, or one of the worst revolutionary battles in American history, and Americans lost greatly. So it kind of has a unfortunate history, but it is a beautiful place, and Lane loved it. So he would travel in a little dinghy, sometimes with friends, and he would go along the shoreline in places like Gloucester and Castine and depict these beautiful harbor settings and coastlines. Now, as I said, he's a second generation Hudson River painter, but he also was called the luminist. And you can imagine that luminosity refers to light. And these particular Lane and Heed, another artist I'm going to show you, they use light as one of the most important aspects of their paintings. The other thing you can see is this is so different than the work of Birch. And let me just go back just a second because I want to make a comparison. See, this is rugged. This is man not coexisting peacefully in nature, but this one is. This Lane, just exquisite, quiet painting. It shows boats quietly floating on the harbor. It almost looks like it's painted on a grid. It's light filled. He's a luminous painter, as I mentioned. It also harkens to his interest in the 17th century Dutch painters. He captures that low horizon line and very beautiful large sky. We see like the sky takes up 3/4 of the painting. We see cumulus and cirrus clouds. We see the light, the sort of the moon as it emerges, or is sort of hidden in the clouds. We see the boats kind of receding. It's not a narrative. He's not telling a story as the Birch painting, a capsized boat and a rescue. This is more about just the ineffable beauty in nature. And he just wants to prove that nature is a calming and important and beautiful influence on our lives. He was also influenced by these painters like John Constable, as I mentioned earlier, who painted man coexisting peacefully in nature. And so he sort of takes this on as well. Lastly, I do want to mention that with his painting, Lane established his connection to the Dutch 17th century because he went to New York and he looked at exhibitions of Dutch 17th century painters, particularly Robert Salmon. And Salmon painted Dutch seascapes. And so Lane really took that inspiration on in his work. This is, of course, one of our jewels of the Timken. Next is one of my favorite paintings by Lane, and this is Lumber Schooners at Evening on Penobscot Bay. And Penobscot Bay is also in Maine. Look at the light. It just sort of takes my breath away, how exquisite the light is. It's magical. It's romantic because, as I mentioned, romantic painters who painted in France, for example, were influencing these artists, because many of them, not Lane, but many of them did travel to France and Italy and England. So they were inspired by what is happening in France. Again, they were also influenced by the British painters, but this is a very elegiac painting. When I mean elegiac, I mean it's kind of mournful, but it's also beautiful. It's poetic. It's lyrical. The clouds with that dappled pink, the profoundly beautiful pale pink of the sky, the dark water. It's just, it kind of takes my breath away. I always think it would make a beautiful image for a children's book, for example. And then, of course, the boat, it's in its incredible detail. So, as I mentioned earlier, these artists were great at capturing tremendous detail in their paintings, like the ship, the figures on the ship, the mast, the wood on the deck, even the little notches in the boat. But also they could capture the more beautiful, larger aspects of nature. So we're going to go on, and we're going to go to another artist who was capturing a lot of the different aspects of American West, and his name was Albert Bierstadt. Now, Bierstadt came from Germany. He also studied with a group called the Dusseldorf group that was in Germany, and then he came to America. And he was such a skilled painter that he developed an amazing audience. In fact, his paintings were so beloved that people would actually pay 50 cents to line up for city blocks. Like we have in America Blockbuster art exhibits, like at the Met and LA County Museum. He created paintings that were like Blockbuster paintings. He made a fortune through his art. Another artist who also was very lucky in his career was Frederick Church, who was contemporary. So Bierstadt went on 3 surveying expeditions for the American government. He was so fascinated by the American landscape in its grandeur, he wanted to branch out and go into the West. So he goes on a surveying party. And this, if you look at the date, this was done around the time of the American Civil War, just around the time. And so he's, we're expanding American territories, and they want artists and photographers, painters and photographers, to document what they're seeing. Now, why isn't photography used? Because Matthew Brady, for example, did use photography during the American Civil War to capture what was happening. But for someone who is painting landscapes, the apparatus for photography was so cumbersome that it would have been sort of impossible. The daguerreotype, for example, huge boxes and chemicals and waiting, and it just wasn't feasible. So what Bierstadt did is he sketched. And then he took this assemblage of sketches back to his studio on the East Coast and created this painting, most likely in his studio. In the foreground of the painting, this is 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲 Falls, Yosemite. It's one of the first white groups to come into this region. You can see his artist paints and brushes. You can see the hobbled horses that are getting ready to rest for the evening. You see the light is the light of early evening. And we see 6 members of the surveying party in the middle, forward to middle ground, arranging things for dinner, cooking. And then you see in the middle to background the Merced River. And we see the magnificent 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲 Falls, which of course is a Native American name. And you see at that time the most beautiful waterfall in America. So again, it's romanticized, but it's realistic at the same time. The capturing of the trees, the horses, but the sky, the light. So it's almost spiritual in its beauty. And of course, people who, I'm embarrassed to say, I haven't been to Yosemite since I was 9 years old, so I don't remember this 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲 Falls. But people who visit it often say he really captured it in a very remarkable way. Next, we're going to do another look at another painting by Bierstadt done much later. And A Storm in the Rocky Mountains, it actually has a subtitle, A Storm in the Rocky Mountains, Rosalie. And what that refers to is his mistress, Rosalie. So let's tell the story a little bit, the backstory, and then we'll talk specifically about the painting. This was the third expedition that Bierstadt took. You know, as you saw, he went into Yosemite Valley, and then here he is in the Rocky Mountains. And again, he was part of these exploration, these missions to survey the land. The railroads are being built. They want to know more about acquired land. And so he was on one of these, and he really wanted to see buffalo. Like that was something he thought, oh, I'm going to see buffalo. I want to capture the beauty of where the Native Americans lived and the grandeur of our American landscape. So he went with his friend, and his friend's wife was named Rosalie. And his friend, who was also a painter, unfortunately was addicted to the drug opium, and he wasn't doing very well. And Bierstadt became involved with his wife. And so he was very much inspired by this new relationship and decided to really romanticize the painting. So what we have here is just this exquisite, just this juxtaposition of dark, dark, dark light, dark, dark, dark geography and landscape, and this beautiful light-filled sky. It's ethereal light. It's exquisite. And what he did in this painting, as I said, he sort of romanticized it, not only in theory, but in depiction. And the romanticizing of this painting makes the Rocky Mountains much larger in scale. And what I mean by that is the scale is established in the foreground of the painting, in the center foreground. So we see men on horseback and some other figures, and they're so minuscule. And what we realize is he wanted to embellish the size, the grandeur of that landscape. So it is romanticized. Also, you have to remember that these artists were all, as I mentioned, were influenced by a lot of the European artists. For example, I told you Bierstadt studied in Germany with the Dusseldorf School, but he knew what was going on in England and France, and particularly the Barbizon painters who were painting the Barbizon woods prior to the Impressionists. Remember the first Impressionist painting, Impression Sunrise, I believe, 1872. So they were aware of the beauty of depicting the landscape outdoors, but they wanted to focus on our landscape, our incredible heritage. And of course, based on the principles of the Transcendentalist movement and this Emerson and all this connection to nature. One other thing I want to point out is at this time and earlier, we are developing a national park system in America. And so a national park system for smaller regional parks, and also for more important, larger national parks. All right, we're going to go to the work of one of my favorites is Martin John Heade. If you want to see the work of some of these Hudson River painters, there are a few places I'd like to point out. One is a Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut. One of the earliest museums in the United States, in fact, I think it is the earliest, and they have an amazing collection of Hudson River painters. Also, the Huntington Library in Pasadena is a great place to see the work of Heade, for example. And lastly, I did mention Crystal Bridges in in Arkansas, we'll just say. So this Heade is completely different than a lot of the Hudson River painters I showed you, because Heade likes the more prosaic, quieter parts of the American landscape. He was interested in sort of a contemplative version of the observation of nature. He loved salt marshes and hay bales. And he also was a tremendous botanical illustrator and a figurative painter. So all the Hudson River painters, in a way, he was most diverse because he did landscape, still life, and figure. Now, approaching thunderstorm. This is really the preamble before the storm. So really it's the beauty of the preamble as opposed to just the storm. So it shows this inky black lake and the young boy sitting on the wood with the puppy. just sort of contemplating how things are going to evolve very shortly as the weather comes in. You can see someone at a rowboat, perhaps they're trying to row to the sailboat in the mid-ground. You can also see the influence of the Baroque on this painting. Again, that sort of low horizon line, that exquisite light and storm clouds. Look how the light, that chiaroscuro, that contrast of light and dark really makes a very dramatic and exquisite painting. So he was quite different. He was really more on the periphery of the Hudson River painters, and I would also call him a luminist because of his exquisite use of light. Now, this is one of our exquisite still life paintings in the Timken, and it's called the Magnolia Blossom. And so I wanted to show you how he just had this variety of abilities, and he paints a magnolia blossom. And a magnolia blossom has a lot of identifiable characteristics. It's exquisitely beautiful. It's very sculptural. And in terms of its, meaning, it means prosperity. It shows self-confidence and pride. That's kind of what a magnolia blossom represents. Now, purity because of its beautiful white petals. Now, he lived in many places. He went to Brazil and he painted orchids and hummingbirds. He was very prolific. He also went to Florida and other parts of the United States, but he did settle in Florida, St. Petersburg to be exact, and he became enamored with these beautiful magnolia blossoms that were blooming all over his area. And so he wanted to capture them, and he loved the sculptural quality. Of course, he too, influenced by the Dutch and the still lifes. And a flower, as I've mentioned many times, it does have it's a memento mori, a reminder of death, in that, flowers have a shelf life. When you pick them, they're little blossoms and then they open gradually and then they wither. So it's kind of commenting on maybe the ephemeral nature of life, but also pride and strength too. What's remarkable about this particular heat is he did a series, I believe 12 to 14 of these magnificent magnolia blossoms, but this is the only one done on red velvet, and as opposed to blue. All the others are done in blue. So that's kind of remarkable that we have this. And again, look at that, how it is just so forefront in the painting, and how the crushed velvet sort of is draping the table, and the leaves look so sculptural. It just shows his focus on detail and the light as it falls on the blossom. Next, we're going to go to one of our own, George Inness. He was also a Hudson River painter, and this is in our wonderful collection. And Inness was an interesting painter in that he really was interested in Italy, and he studied the works of the Renaissance artists, and he very much wanted to visit Italy and study there and capture the landscape. Now you might say, well, if it's Italy, how is it the Hudson River Valley or parts of the United States? But as I said, these artists, many of them went to Europe to study. Some of them were born there, like in England, Germany, as I mentioned. But Inness particularly wanted to study the landscape of Italy. So this is done on his third trip. And what we have here is a town. And in the background to the right, we see this beautiful town with this gorgeous cupola. And that cupola is a church cupola, obviously. And it was designed by Bernini, the great Baroque sculptor, architect. And this village is most likely, part of it was medieval and Renaissance, and then Baroque, of course, with the cupola. And then we have some campanile bell towers in the back. In the foreground of the painting, we have a really remarkable bridge with some vegetation. We have people herding sheep. We have in the background more of the city at the very background. Now you can see this sky as extremely connected to not only Dutch painting, but also some of the French artists. They were definitely inspired. He was definitely inspired by the Barbizon painters who painted the Barbizon woods. Theodore Rousseau, for example, Corot, very influenced by Corot. Also the work of Claude Lorrain, who is a French artist. He was very inspired by his landscapes. And then of course the Italian artists that he studied when he was in Italy. This was done with sketches. He did multiple sketches of this particular landscape. And then, of course, he brought it back to his studio in America and created this magnificent work. A couple more things I want to point out is, again, it's romanticized, the beautiful vegetation, the crescent moon in the sky. This is the end of day. It's very quiet. It's very contemplative. You know, how do we feel at the end of the day? So it harkens to that sort of human emotion. Now, just for time constraints, I'm going to move on because I tend to run out. This is probably one of our most important paintings. I mean, they're all important because they're all just, our collection is so first rate. But this Cranberry Harvest Island of Nantucket, many people believe that this is Eastman Johnson's finest work. It puts him in the pantheon of Winslow Homer and Eakins. And what he shows here is something very, very important. In fact, in all of art history, this is probably the most important painting to depict a community working together to achieve a goal. And what are they doing? They're harvesting cranberries. Now, you might think, oh, I always thought before I married my husband, who's from Boston, and we spent time in New England, I always thought cranberries were in really boggy, marshy. That isn't always true. That is only at one point. And so as they're ready for harvest, you pick them in a dry environment. So over 40 people on the island of Nantucket are picking cranberries. Eastman Johnson, this is kind of a narrative, but more than that, it's really he saw the seed and he's capturing the concept of working together and the disappearing agrarian way of life in America. You know, we're getting on to the Gilded Age, and we've got a lot of industrialization occurring. This is post-Civil War. You know, America's really changed, and like other Hudson River painters, he's second generation, of course, they miss the more rural way of life. Yes, it's easier with the cotton gin and the harvester and things like that, but at the same time, they miss the working together as a community. Now, this is a very horizontal painting. It took Eastman Johnson over 17 preparatory drawings to create this painting. He didn't just plein air paint. What he did is he created vignettes, this cluster of figures, this cluster of figures here, and then he put it together. Today, a landscape painter, if they were doing something this ambitious, they might photograph it and then assemble the images and then paint it. Look at the light. Just like other artists I mentioned, very inspired by the Dutch landscape painters like the Van Ruysdael of the 17th century. Look how the light falls, that chiaroscuro, that light falls on the woman. She's the beacon and the center of this painting. She looks to the distance, to the right, because her young son is carrying a child, and she wants to make sure he does it appropriately. So I saw the assemblage of these 17 drawings in, I'm sorry if I mentioned this, at the Timken years and years ago. They assembled all the preparatory drawings so you could see the evolution of the painting. It was just an amazing exhibition. So most of this group of people were women. And although there's a few men, like a gentleman, older gentleman in a chair helping, we see overturned cranberries. We see a lot of detail, hyper detail, the blades of grass, the light as it falls on the apron of the young girl, and the windmill in the background, and the church steeple, showing what is important to the American way of life. Quickly, this Eastman Johnson was done a little earlier, and it is in the San Diego Museum of Art. It's a lovely painting of a woman reading. This, I keep mentioning the Dutch, but of course they're so prominent. This resembles a Dutch painting of the 17th century. You can see that individual woman, that low horizon line, the boat, the sails mimic her bonnet and her book as she reads in a very quiet manner. So Eastman Johnson was a great figurative artist. It shows how he could capture a whole composite group of people, but also a simple figure in a landscape. I have to be a little brief because of time constraints. Now, James Abbott McNeill Whistler was an American, but he spent most of his life in Europe. Like Winslow Homer and Thomas Eakins, he was considered one of the most important painters of the latter part of the 19th century. And Symphony in White was very controversial. So really quickly, Whistler was born in America. He actually attended the West Point like his father, who worked for the government as a railroad engineer, but he lived in St. Petersburg, Russia. He spent a lot of time in Paris, where he met Manet, and he knew the works of a lot of the emerging Impressionist artists and the Barbizon painters. He was greatly influenced by the pre-Raphaelite artists, Millet, and others who harkened back to the beauty of the medieval times and chivalry, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, for example. So he paints this in a more art for art's sake. It's not specifically a portrait of his mistress, who you can see here, but it's more about art and its connection to music, and it's the beauty of art for art's sake. And so look at this white gown and this white drapery and her white skin and the white flower. So it is a study in white, and it was done 300 years after Titian's beautiful study of a woman in white that was actually shown at the Norton Simon Museum about 3 years ago. I wanted to make that comparison. The woman stands on a wolfskin rug. She holds a white flower of purity. She has this cascading red hair and the cambric dress, which is almost like a nightgown. And it was kind of shocking to people. So much so that when he tried to show this at age 27 to be in the Royal Academy, it was refused. And it was just dumped in a corner, and he saw it and he was horrified. But he was very lucky, because just like Manet's Déjeuner célèbre, this painting was put in the Salon de Refusé, which were the wonderful paintings that were not put in the Academy exhibition, and they were exhibited separately. So it did get some notoriety. Really quickly, it's kind of a contrast between innocence and the loss of innocence. So you might look at his beautiful mistress as something pure and spiritual, although that seems like was his mistress, sorry to say. They said they were married without benefit of clergy, so they did have a long-standing relationship. But you see her standing on this wolf rug, and the wolf rug is almost like the Garden of Eden and a snake. So it's kind of the Virgin Mary with purity and kind of that religious aura that she has, but at the same time, it's also dealing with temptation and such. Now, this Peacock Room is one of the most amazing works by Whistler. It's not only by Whistler, but it is now in the Freer Gallery at the Smithsonian. And this is a hugely controversial interior. It was based on Anglo-Japanese interests. A lot of these artists were interested in Japanese art, as were European artists. And he was asked to finish this. It was a townhouse owned by Frederick Leland in England, in London. And Frederick Leland was a rich shipping magnate. And he commissioned a couple architects to create this dining room. Well, one of the architects became seriously ill. And Whistler, who was doing some work on this mansion, said, well, I can finish it. I can finish the interior. But he went a little overboard in terms of the owner. And he put in this deep, beautiful blue, and he took a lot of gold paint, and he wanted to highlight the post-Ming Dynasty collection of porcelain that Leland had, but he also wanted to comment on these wall hangings that were from Catherine of Aragon that Leland had bought. And Catherine of Aragon, of course, was married to Henry VIII. And so her emblem was not only peacocks, but roses. And he wanted to highlight with these coffered ceilings and beautiful inset of porcelain, except when Leland saw it, the owner, he was horrendously upset. He thought it was atrocious. And he sued Whistler. And Whistler actually became bankrupt over this. It was a huge, terrible problem. So I'm going to move on because we only have a couple more minutes, and I want to go into Winslow Homer, one of the most important American painters. Winslow Homer had such a varied career. He captured the battles of the Civil War, but he also was very influenced by the emerging Impressionist painters and the Barbizon painters. He loved the realism of Courbet. That's what he captured when he did the Civil War paintings. But he also was studying the emerging Impressionist movement, and he loved this gestural quality. This is not a tight, realistic painting. As you saw, it's very gestural and painterly and light-filled. And Gloucester, which is today a great shipping area, lobster, some of the best lobster I've ever eaten is in Gloucester, but it was also a place where artists would hang out in the summertime. And that's where Winslow Homer would sometimes spend his summers. And so getting away from the war, like 8 years later, he wanted to do something calmer, more benign. And he does capture these young children sailing in a boat. However, he does go back a little bit later, as he goes forward, he gets a little tired of sort of these quiet contemplative moments, and he goes back to sociological issues. And here we have a boat, a dory, and in the front of the boat, we have, bow of the ship, we have halibut. So the ship, this fisherman has captured this fish, but it is not a quiet time. This is a very dangerous point for this this fisherman, because you can see a bank of fog, and the fog actually mirrors his form. And what's happening is he's got to row to the ship in the middle to background of the painting. But if the cloud envelops him, he'll never make it. One false move, this man could die. And so what Winslow Homer did is he went to England and he studied the sad and difficult life of fishermen and also those living in the United States on the East Coast. And he, like he did with the Civil War paintings, he's showing the importance of sociological studies that affect mankind, just like Courbet did, Gustave Courbet did, and Millet, and some of the French painters. Look how this is a very treacherous scene. Now, we just have a couple more, and of course, Allison will let us know that we just have a couple minutes for questions. And I do hope that you do have some questions. But I think lastly, I'll just talk about this Thomas Eakins. And Thomas Eakins was interested in movement. And just really quickly, this is one of the most important American paintings ever done. It shows an operation that is done not in a sterile environment. It is, instead of an amputation, this young man is having his leg operated on, which is unusual. The mother is cringing in the corner. The artist is leaning over, taking notes. He's in the center. You see the kind of gruesome tools, and you see Dr. Eakins operating. So this is a remarkable painting. And I think we'll stop there because Allison is ready to take questions, and we just do hope that you have some.
Thank you so much, Karen. Yeah, that was a great look at 19th century American art, but also I was just so struck by, I feel like we saw every corner of our country, you know, from the magnolia blossoms in Florida to Yosemite to, you know, the island of Nantucket and all of these different things. So I feel like we got a little tour of the country.
Exactly.
Yeah, we do have time for some questions. So I don't see any in the chat, but you're also welcome to unmute yourself at this time if you just want to ask your question out loud. The microphone button in the lower left corner is where you're going to unmute yourself. So yeah, maybe I'll give a minute if anyone has any questions. Or you can also put them in the chat, either way.
We love questions.
Well, maybe I'll get us started, and then while people are thinking, oh, I do see, actually, did someone unmute themselves?
I did.
Oh, great, go ahead.
Good.
Hello, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. One of my favorite periods, particularly being an American. When you talked about the course of empire being
Yes.
the first of 5 paintings, what can you tell us about the rest? Do they all feature Native Americans, things like that?
Oh no, that is an excellent question. Excellent question. No, not all of them, because as I don't know if I mentioned these 3 words before, but discovery, exploration, and settlement were the kind of guiding words during that time in the 19th century. And so I think what he's really commenting on is how the landscape began to be overcome by settlement and change. And so he shows it kind of in sequences. So the first one is what happens when they discover the land occupied by the Native Americans. And then the subsequent paintings, if I'm not mistaken, were more about other aspects of the landscape. And so it wasn't, his focus was kind of on the next chapter, more of the settlement. So what we're seeing in that particular painting, the first one of that, is more of the discovery. So I hope I'm correct on that one. And if I do some research and I find that I'm incorrect, I hope that you attend my next lecture and I just will bring that up. But as far as I recall, this was really the Native American life and its change, and what's happening to Native American life is really the focus of just that one painting.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think it's always the same location, right? So you have that kind of mountain in the background, and so it's supposed to show the same site kind of over time, right?
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Allison. Very good point. Yes. So just that evolution, discover and explore and settle. So, but thank you. That was an excellent question.
Yeah.
Anybody else, please feel free.
We have a couple from Facebook that came through the chat there. The first is, can you elaborate on the influence of the Luminists? I think I'm trying to remember who it was. You mentioned one of the artists was also.
Oh yes, of course, Henry Lane. So I'm sorry, what was the question about Lane?
Just their influence on American art, maybe.
Of course. Well, you have to remember that. Okay, light is so important to so many movements in art, and also we have to remember that photography. Some of these artists actually, like Eakins, for example, they dabbled in photography. So the study of light, the continuum of light from, let's say, the Baroque was so prominent, and also just that capturing of the American light. So it really is it's a technological interest, it's a historical interest, and it's also just this skill of the particular artists like Heed and Lane to be able to depict light, because they, as I mentioned earlier, light is almost spiritual in these paintings. This ineffable beauty that they wanted to capture. And light seems to really enhance that. So they studied the effects of light on landscape and really wanted to promote that. I hope
that sort of term, it can be, it can cross genres, right? Like you can be a Hudson River painter or I don't know, some other type of painter, but also a luminist.
Okay, that's a wonderful point. Actually, luminists really connect to the Hudson River. And really usually use the term luminist in particular, specifically to the Hudson River painters, because they were the subcategory. Because it was really then that this luminosity became like the forefront. So I really don't use that term too often unless I'm talking about a subcategory of Hudson River.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, it's exactly a subcategory. Yeah. Okay, great. And then our last question, I think that we have on Facebook at least, how did Bierstadt end up in California?
Okay, so good question. So his family, he immigrated to the United States with his family, and when he was young, and he was an artist fairly young though, because he did study in the Dusseldorf school, so he wasn't like a teenager. I believe he might have been in his early 20s, if I'm not mistaken. But he wanted to be part of these surveying expeditions, so he connected with some other artists and government officials. He kind of volunteered to be part of this surveying group because he wanted inspiration, and he was really interested in, he was not American, so he really was inspired to see more of America. And so that's why he kind of took on this role of depicting the landscape. So he actually became part of a surveying party around the time of the Civil War. And many of these surveyors, not only were they looking at land that was acquired, but the territories that were increasing, but also the development of the railroad. They were building railroads, so they had to kind of understand the landscape. So he did it as an adventure.
Yeah, so he kind of had multiple jobs too. He was not just an artist, like being brought out there by the art. He kind of had a side hustle as well.
Exactly, and when I showed you the Rocky Mountains, I don't know if I mentioned this, but he purposely wanted to see buffalo. He'd heard all this kind of romantic thing about buffalo, so he thought, if I go to the Rocky Mountains, I'm going to see Native Americans, and because he's really interested in Native American life, fascinated, and he also is interested in like the buffalo, and so he took on that project. So just like you say, it was like his side hustle to take his artistic skills and use them for other things. But he became very successful. He was one of the most successful of all these artists.
He probably wasn't a surveyor forever. Yeah.
No, because he didn't actually do the surveying. He would document what the surveyors were doing. So, okay, we're gonna, document this portion, and then he was going to depict it. So it was more of the like the chronicler of what was happening.
Yeah, and you can absolutely see that in his art.
Right.
All right, I think our last question here from Nancy Wong. The artist who did landscapes, still life, and portraits, did he go to school for each genre? If you were an artist who could do the whole thing, do you have to study each of those individually?
Hi, Nancy. Nancy's a good friend of mine. Martin John Heed, I believe, is the one who did landscape, still lifes, and figurative portraits. That is a really good question, because mostly when artists go to school, at least in the 19th century and earlier, they had to do figurative drawing, like they had to draw from life models. Many times they would go out in nature just to study it, and kind of, he loved to travel. So he was always going to places, like I said, South America, Brazil, and the beautiful tropical and rainforest birds and plants fascinated him. So he began to sketch them. Now, he found that he was good at all these things, but whether he went to study each element, I don't think so necessarily. I think it would be something you would learn in art school. Like, I know artists today who are amazing because they can do all those things. And I know some artists who say, I'm a very good figurative artist, but and that's what I'm going to focus on. And I'm not going to do too many still lifes or landscapes. I really, I want to do figures. But, a lot of these, like, even if you look at the clinic of Dr. Gross, you can see elements of everything, because there are elements of still life here. And there's a figure obviously very prominent, but then we have sort of this backdrop, an interior landscape. So these artists had great technical skill. And then if they chose to, and they had the interest, they could pretty much do anything. So I hope that answered your question, but
yeah, and I think we've talked about maybe in some of your past lectures about how they would purposefully put in each of those, it would be a portrait, but then they put a landscape in the background and maybe a still life in the foreground to kind of show that they could do all of these different things, sort of show off their expertise, right?
Perfect comment, Allison.
Yeah.
Perfect comment, because like, even when we look at the Mona Lisa from 1501, I believe, there is that Leonardo was very interested in the landscape. He did all these studies, so he wanted to show how the importance of the landscape and in the architectural elements. And just like you say, it's that kind of hey, look, I'm skilled at this. I can do this. I can do that. But yes, your point is very well taken. Good point.
Great. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us. Thank you so much again for presenting, all of these different artists. And it's so great to kind of take a step outside of our collection and bring in lots of other things. That is one of the benefits of a virtual tour, right?
I agree. And thank you so much, Allison. And thank you all for attending. I hope to see you again next month.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to remind everyone next month. Yes, the third Wednesday of every month. So at 11 a.m. and you can find all the information on our website. I know I was trying to think of the theme for next time, and I'm not sure I can remember it.
It's Baroque painting in Spain. So we'll look at Zurbarán and Velázquez and Murillo and some of the others. So it'll be, I look very forward to it. So it's one I haven't done for this series. So
great. Okay, so the Spanish Baroque next month. But I want to also remind everyone that we do have tours that are really focused on our collection every Thursday at 11 a.m. So tomorrow, if you're not super familiar with our collection, we looked at a couple of them here, but we'll kind of go through every gallery. And so that's tomorrow, Thursday at 11 a.m. every Thursday. And again, you can go to our website, timkenmuseum.org/calendar, or you can also just go to timkenmuseum.org and then go to the events tab, and you'll see all the information for each one. If you're on Facebook, you can also go to the events tab on our Facebook page, and there's all the different events there as well. So we hope to see you at a future event. Thank you again, Karen, for the great lecture.
And thank you all for attending. And I hope to see you next month or for the weekly lectures as well.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Thank you all so much. See you next time.